Welcome, listeners, to the Finance for Starters podcast. Your hosts, Michael Pfister, Wealth Manager.
And Austin Mylott, Director of Insurance Sales.
So last week we covered long-term care. This week we will be covering disability, a topic that our host here, Austin, is pretty well versed in.
Yeah, I see it a lot in my day-to-day activities, driving around selling disability insurance. It's a pretty interesting topic. It's a pretty useful product. It's just a lot of people aren't too familiar with it, and they're not really sure exactly what it is, what it's used for, if they need it. So we'll hopefully answer some of those questions today.
Let's start out with the first topic, which is, what is disability insurance?
So at the end of the day, it really is just an insurance policy that covers your salary, essentially, what you make a year, up to a certain percentage of it. If you get injured to the point of where you can't work anymore for a set period of time, so if you can't work for 6 months, a year, something like that, it'll cover you for that time period.
Are there different types of disability policies out there, or?
So there's your standard disability policy, which is there's a short-term or a long-term option. That's pretty much just covering your income if you were to stop being able to work. And then there's a business overhead expense type of policy, which is more for business owners who are also, primary money makers for their business. So if you're, let's say, a dentist and you get hurt and you can't work and you still need to pay your employees, keep the lights on, pay leases on equipment, whatever. I'm not really sure how a dentist's office is set up. I'm not really sure what their expenses look like, but you can cover those business expenses with this policy.
That's some great information there, Austin. What is the difference between the short-term and long-term disability?
So short-term is typically 3 to 6 months coverage period. If you get hurt, a broken arm, let's say, it heals in 2-3 months. You're out of work for that time, but you'll come back quickly. The long-term tends to be over 6 months, and that's for more permanent or long-term disabilities. So you lose usage of your legs. That's more of a long-term disability policy.
I've heard that there's been some misuse of disability insurance. Have you seen that affect the market at all?
A little bit, yes. Not so much in the aftermarket. Once the policy is purchased, I haven't seen it really affect the policies themselves. What I've seen it affect is sort of the way that the industry works. It's become a lot more black and white, a lot more, there's not as much flexibility as with a lot of other insurance types of life insurance. There's not as much room to work within the confines of the law with disability just to kind of prevent these misuses.
Now, whenever I'm doing some planning with clients, I see that their employers have disability insurance for them. Do you find that is sufficient for the client, or what is your take on that?
So that's a little bit of a tough question, because the answer to that is yes and no. And that's the best answer to give. It's a hard yes and no. Usually those policies from your employer, they're good. They're good coverage. They give you what you need. The issue with that is that usually if you leave that job, you don't take those policies with you. And even if you leave on Monday and Tuesday you find another job which gives you a disability insurance through your work, it can take up to 6 months for that to kick into effect. So there is a possibility of being without this coverage for a long time. And if, say, you need to utilize it within that 6 months, you're essentially uninsured. So if you're going to work somewhere for your entire life, the disability that they provide is probably fine. But as we've seen a lot in the past, 10, 15 years, people aren't really working at the same place as long as they used to. So it's definitely a good idea to look into some supplemental coverage, even if you have a policy through your work. And while that policy may be fine, you may not have it forever.
Now, life insurance, a lot of life insurance policies require a medical exam. Is there any sort of medical exam that you need to take for when you're applying for disability?
There is. It's just a pretty basic medical overview. It's really just to make sure that you're not, you go to your doctor, you find out that you're not able to work for 6 months, and you go buy the policy that same day. The medical exam is really to prevent those kind of things, just to say, before you even get this policy, are you disabled? Do you need it? And then you have to be healthy to purchase the policy. So you can't really game the system so much.
Now, this is probably on the minds of a lot of our listeners, but what does something like this cost?
It really just depends on the policy. That's a tough one to ask. The pricing really comes down to the length of the period, the elimination period, benefit period. So there's not a clear cut, it's $100 a month for everybody. It really just depends on what you're looking for and the kind of policy that you get.
Okay. Now, is there anything else that you would like to add in terms of this topic, or?
Yeah, so the definition of disabled is definitely something I would like to bring up. There's two different common definitions that they use, and it's own occupation or any occupation. What that means is if you're disabled under the own occupation, it means that you're disabled to a point of where you can't work in your specific job. So if you're a plumber and you have a knee injury that prevents you from, crawling around looking for pipes, doing all that stuff, looking for pipes. That's what they do. That's what plumbers do. They search for pipes. If you're not able to perform your job, that would be own occupation. If you're injured so catastrophically that you're not able to perform any work, that would be any occupation. So those are sort of the two definitions that they give for disabled. And I think that's important information for people to have because it's a little bit tough, what really counts as disabled.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us on disability. Stay tuned next week. We will be talking about financial planning and what you need to know.
It's going to be a great topic. Happy to have everybody listening and hope you enjoy this week's podcast. Hope you like next week's even more.